What is going on, y'all? I'm KM Best, and between the release of Dakin and this patch, the Marvel Snap metagame is going to be shook up tremendously. Let's take a look at what is coming in this patch. The first card changed in the patch is Cable. He now reads that you take the card from the top of your opponent's deck as opposed to the bottom. This is a response to the change to America Chavez. America Chavez began staying on the bottom of decks, which made Cable much worse when he only took from the bottom. Now, this is more than a buff in just that context, however. When you take a card from the bottom of the deck, that's not a card your opponent was going to draw. When you take a card from the top of the deck, that is. And this, in practice doesn't tend to matter that much because they obviously don't know whether they were going to draw that card or not, but it can definitely make you feel a bit better playing this card. You also get to know, the main advantage of Cable is you get to know if perhaps their combo deck is missing a combo piece, their synergy deck is missing a synergy piece. I'm a little more interested in trying the card out now, not necessarily because I think it's like, the greatest card of all time, but there are a lot of cards that give information right now. Cable, of course, being one of them, Mirage being another. There's a lot of cards that seem to give information about the cards your opponent is playing, and in addition, those cards seem to go into a dinosaur shell, so I'm kind of wondering if there's some point in just trying to find out all the sneaky things your opponents are trying, and just jamming all of that into a good card's dinosaur shell. That would be where I would want to go with Cable. That said, I will say, the only time Cable has ever been metagame relevant was in the first month of the open beta. There was a deck called Dinova Carnage, back when Devil Dinosaur, of course, cost 3, and Nova was a 1/2 that gave +2 when it died. You'd use Cable in those mirrors in order to take the specific card that you needed, right? So if you got their Nova, you knew you could snap. If you got their Dino, their Moon Girl, you knew you could snap. And that seems to be where I would want to see him in the future, not necessarily in that deck, obviously, but in a similar situation where you are looking for specific things, where your win condition in certain matchups is, I'm going to Cable this. He's not going to be great, but if you have other things that go with him, like Mirage, like Devil Dinosaur, maybe this guy can finally see some play. Next up is, of course, Magik. Now, in the previous OTA, they mentioned that this change was coming, but basically what they're doing is making it so you can play Magik on the final turn of the game, on turn 6, it just won't work. So this is mostly a buff to her. It is almost entirely upside. The only situation in which it is downside is if you are doing some really intense shenanigans, like if you have a Magik under Invisible Woman and your goal is to pull the Invisible Woman with like a Heimdall so that then your Magik activates on turn 6. That is a thing people have tried to do. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, and now with this change, it will not work. This is all upside for basically every other Magik deck, although it's the kind of upside where it'll almost never matter. You are rarely looking to play 2 power using 3 energy on the late turns of the game. It is not something that's going to happen a lot. I'd be surprised if it happened, not necessarily ever, but I'd be surprised if the individual person ever encountered a situation where this was a change that it really mattered. That said, I mean, we've seen Magik metas before. We were in one only a few weeks ago before we brought back the Darkhawk deck in order to counteract all of these Magik scammers. And I do think that this is a card that has a real place. And I think that, if the Darkhawk deck, if decks that are really trying to counter the, Living Tribunal deck or whatever it is, whatever dumb thing it is you're doing with Magik, whatever ridiculous combo it is, if you see less of the counters to it, obviously it can come back in the metagame. Will this change be the reason for it? No. But, hey, it's mostly upside. Speaking of insane high roll decks that rely on a turn 7 from Magik, Mr. Negative is also seeing an upside-based change. Now, you should note, this change will not actually change his card text, just his functionality. But the change is that now Mr. Negative cannot make things cost more than 6. So, for example, and this is likely to be the most important example, your Jane Foster, after you play a Mr. Negative, if you draw her, will now cost 6 instead of 8. And that's pretty important because, especially in those decks, the Jane Foster being unplayable was a legitimate problem. But now, if you can land and protect a Magik, you can play the Jane Foster on turn 6 going into a turn 7. That's really, really, really important, and that would be what I would expect this change to create in Mr. Negative decks. You are now no longer entirely, completely dead if your Jane Foster is in deck and you happen to draw her after you play Mr. Negative. Another interesting thing to think about is, can we make this more likely to happen by playing America Chavez? I mean, it's not like she's going to be unplayable now. I don't think we can, because I think we still want to draw Jane on 6 if she's in our deck. I think just the most important thing is drawing Jane, and the way to maximize drawing Jane is, of course, not playing America Chavez. But I mean, if we're looking for like specifically Magik into Mr. Negative into Jane, there might actually be some math to do there on whether or not that makes any sense. Now, that said, I do think this is mostly a minor change, but that specific outcome being removed from your pool is good for Mr. Negative Jane Foster decks, undeniably. Another change that is going to change how the card works, but not actually change the card text, is Rogue will now copy on reveals if the ongoing card she copied had one. So, for example, if you copy a Soulstone with her, you will get to draw a card and get the ongoing effect of Soulstone. That is almost singularly the only place where this is going to happen. I'm going to assume none of y'all are going to be in the business of roguing Electros, but hey, what do I know? So this is a pretty minor change. Rogue already a reasonable card, and this now just sort of adds a little bit of functionality to make it go more like how it seems like it should go. Sort of like how Mr. Negative now works exactly like the Peak. Rogue now works a little bit more how you intuitively would think she would work, and for that reason, I think this is a good change. The big one. Spider-Man is no longer Spider-Man. I don't really know how else to say it. Spider-Man in his current form is one of the key pieces of many lockdown strategies, from Thanos to High Evolutionary to just straight up Guardians of the Galaxy style lockdown decks, and he's gone. He is no longer serving that functionality. And I think a lot of people are going to be very grateful for that. Most people tend to like it when they can play their cards, and Spider-Man very obviously says, you can't play your cards. And so now he is going to a much more dynamic form, a much more interesting form, but maybe a little bit less powerful one. We'll have to see. Now he costs 3, has 5 power, and when you play him, he moves somewhere and drags one of your opponent's cards there as well. So he's like a combination Stegron or Polaris kind of card, where the interesting thing I think for me is he is a guaranteed move trigger. So Spider-Man will always turn on Miles. It's always happening. There's nothing you need to do to make it happen. And I think he's also like sort of pseudo removal if you can get it. Like if your opponent has a big unit on a lane and you want to drag that big unit to literally anywhere else, an obvious answer would be like if they played a card like a Tuma, this card is suddenly extremely good against it, dragging it to any other lane where it will presumably immediately die. And there are some real upsides to this, because this is also a 3-cost card, so there's obvious Silver Surfer potential there. But I think also there is some real life in the move control archetype right now, and having a guaranteed Miles proc plus an efficient body with some efficient movement on it, that's a really interesting piece to add. Another thing that he could end up influencing is he's a little bit odd in terms of how you want to apply him. So you can try to apply him to a lane with small stuff in it with the attempt to get him into a closed off lane, or you can try to apply him to a lane with big stuff in it with the attempt to get one of the big things out of that lane so you can win it, or he can just be a move proc. I think this is a suddenly very, very interesting card. It strikes me as pretty competitively costed for what the effect is. I like the synergy with something like, Craven or Miles, things that are really doing things. I also like that it has some real synergy with the rest of the Spider people, because almost every other Spider-Man card is about moving stuff around, Spider-Ham accepted, of course, but like Silk, Gwen, these are cards that are about moving stuff around, and now Peter fits with them as well. You can really set up the Spider-Verse crew of Miles and Gwen and Peter, and you can really start to do stuff there. I think it's a pretty interesting card that's going to have a lot of interesting and unique applications that is costed, I think, very aggressively for what its effect is. So I do expect to see this card running around at some point, or, you know, swinging around as it were. And I think this is definitely one to keep an eye on. Finally, we have another change to a high evolutionary version of a card. Now that Hulk and Wasp have been changed, they are also changing the Thing. And I think most people are going to look at this and go, oh, they nerfed the Thing. But I'm actually a little more interested in him now, and I'll tell you why. So what they did is they made it so now he can only affect each unit at the location one time, but he's guaranteed to hit 3. So it's not like he's always dunking one thing. If you play him on a location with only 1 unit in it, it will only get -1. But if you play him on a location with 3 units in it, you get 3 guaranteed procs. And I'll tell you why that matters, because Abomination is a card that you can really, really miss on the margins with. And that guarantee that when you play the Thing in a lane with 3 units in it, you will get -3 energy on Abomination, I think is actually a really, really unique and interesting one. Because now between like Abomination and between the Thing and Spider-Woman, you should have this covered, right? Like you have a lot of leeway to get a lot of negative power onto a lot of units with this. And a free Abomination is unbelievable. Obviously, like, even a cheap Abomination is unbelievable, but, like, a free one is infinitely better. And I think that is the major thing that strikes me about this, is I was already experimenting with, like, some overlap between Thanos and High Evolutionary in one of my most recent videos. I don't think this changes that at all. I think it actually makes it better. I'm interested to see what this does in a pure Evo deck, because making sure that you get that Abomination cheap is quite powerful. It honestly also makes me want to kind of re-examine a little bit if we can go back to like Abomination plus Wave kind of decks, where it's like just absolutely lock them out. Abomination that costs 2 or less, and then Wave on turn 5, and there's just no way for them to really catch up. I'm a little interested in trying something like that when this card is in the form that it's in. Now, there are some, you know, hitches in that plan, but between this card and a Wasp, you're probably going to get an Abomination that costs 2, right? Like, that seems actually pretty straightforward to me. So, I really want to investigate, like, can we bring back some sort of, like, Doomwave style Evo deck? Is that a thing? Are we able to accomplish that? Because anytime you can pair Wave with something really big, it is quite powerful. And I think this is the kind of card that can really make sure that you're pairing Wave with something huge. I hope you enjoyed my take on these nerfs. Of course, this is also the first day of Daken's release, or as I like to call him, Daken, because he is Daken, and he is enough. Now, I am going to be live on Twitch while you're watching this video, probably. My schedule is, of course, 6 p.m. So if you want to see me playing around with these new cards, you can check me out on there, twitch.tv/KMBestMS. Remember, like, subscribe, all the things that make my dopamine receptors go burr. Haven't done that in a while. That is for you. I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Peace.